The unthinkable order. Chris Blackwood leaned back in his chair at the Stellar Palate, a high-end restaurant known for its exclusive, exotic menu. It was a celebration night. He had just completed a high-risk security contract, and his account was flush with enough credits to enjoy some of the finer things in life. The ambient lighting reflected off crystalline chandeliers, casting a warm glow over the establishment's polished meteorite tables. Around him, alien patrons dined in quiet luxury, their conversations a mix of deep reverberations, hisses, and soft trills. A tall, gray-skinned alien waiter approached, carrying a holographic menu in one of its 4 arms. "May I take your order, sir?" the being asked in smooth, practiced English. Chris glanced over the menu. The options were wildly diverse, dishes from a dozen different planets, some unpronounceable, others outright unrecognizable. His eyes settled on something familiar. "I'll have the rare steak," he said. "As bloody as you can make it." The waiter's face curled into what might have been a grin. "An excellent choice. We specialize in the freshest servings. Would you prefer the traditional preparation or," it hesitated, its black, lidless eyes narrowing slightly, "shall we serve it live?" Chris frowned. "Traditional is fine." "Very well, sir. Your fresh serving will arrive shortly." Chris took a sip of his drink, savoring the burn of the locally distilled spirit. It was a moment of rare peace, a luxury for someone in his profession. The work of a security specialist meant living on high alert, but tonight, he allowed himself a brief respite. That peace shattered when the waiter returned, not with a plate of meat, but with 2 security guards escorting a young woman. Chris's stomach turned as he took in the sight. She was humanoid, but unmistakably alien, her skin a soft shade of blue, her long black hair flowing in waves down her back. She was dressed in little more than an ornamental corset and undergarments, her wrists and ankles bound in delicate silver chains that clinked with every trembling step she took. The waiter gestured to her with something akin to pride. "Your fresh serving, sir." Chris sat in stunned silence as the weight of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. "Would you like us to prepare her here?" The waiter lifted a gleaming knife. "We can demonstrate the freshness of the meat." Chris fought to keep his expression neutral, but every instinct screamed at him to act. The woman, his supposed meal, met his gaze, her deep blue eyes filled with silent desperation. "That won't be necessary," Chris said smoothly, his mind already racing through scenarios. "I prefer to handle the preparation myself." The waiter inclined its head. "A personal touch." "How refined. Would you like fetting tools?" "No need," Chris replied, forcing a casual air. "I have my own preferences." The waiter hesitated for a moment before stepping back with a respectful bow. "As you wish, sir. But do be cautious, this one has been known to bite." Chris's fingers tightened around his drink. "Noted." As soon as the staff withdrew, the woman turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please. Please don't eat me." Chris leaned in slightly, keeping his posture relaxed but his tone firm. "I'm not going to eat you," he murmured. "But we need to act fast." Hope flickered in her expression. You're not. Just stay calm and play along," he instructed, pulling out his credit chip and pretending to examine her like a buyer inspecting merchandise. He stole a glance around the restaurant. There were guards at the entrance, 2 more near the kitchen, and security cameras in every corner. Not impossible odds, but it required finesse. He tapped a large sum onto his credit chip and signaled the waiter. "The serving appears satisfactory. I'll be taking it to go." The waiter's many arms hesitated. "Sir, our policy." Chris slid the credit chip across the table. "A sum far beyond the cost of any meal. I believe this should cover any policy concerns." The waiter's pupils dilated slightly as it examined the transfer. Finally, it inclined its head. "Of course, sir. Will you be requiring transport assistance?" Chris stood and reached for the woman, placing a possessive hand on her shoulder to sell the illusion. That won't be necessary. They walked slowly toward the exit, every nerve in Chris's body on high alert. The guards watched but did not intervene. After all, he had paid for his meal. Once they stepped out into the cool night air, Chris led her toward his speeder. "Hold still," he murmured, pulling a compact multi-tool from his belt. With practiced efficiency, he sliced through her bindings. The chains fell away, and she rubbed her wrists, her expression a mix of relief and disbelief. You really weren't going to?" Chris nodded. "No. Humans don't eat sentient beings." Her eyes filled with gratitude, but then they darted nervously toward the restaurant. "They'll come after us," she whispered. "The restaurant, it's owned by the Crimson Syndicate." Chris let out a low breath. Of course it was. The Syndicate was one of the most powerful crime organizations in the sector. And he had just walked out with their merchandise. "Good thing," he said, guiding her into the speeder. "I specialize in security." As the vehicle lifted off, neon lights reflecting off its sleek surface, she turned to him, her hands still trembling. I have a name," she whispered. Chris spared her a quick glance. "What is it?" "Sci-Fi." He nodded. "Chris. And we need to move. Fast." Sci-Fi's expression darkened. "They won't just let me go. They'll hunt us down." Chris grinned, his adrenaline kicking in. "Let them try." As the speeder darted into the crowded skyline of New Singapore, 3 black pursuit vehicles detached from the normal flow of traffic, their headlights locking onto Chris's rear sensors. Sci-Fi gasped. "They're already here." Chris tightened his grip on the controls, his heartbeat steadying. He'd been in worse situations before. He threw the speeder into a sharp dive between towering skyscrapers. "Hold on tight, beautiful." The chase had begun. The pursuit begins. The neon-drenched skyline of New Singapore blurred past as Chris wove his speeder between the towering structures. The 3 Syndicate pursuit vehicles closed in fast, their engines howling like hungry beasts. Red tracking lasers danced across the dashboard, his pursuers were locking onto his craft. Sci-Fi clutched the safety harness, her blue skin glowing faintly under the ambient city lights. "You seem unusually calm for someone being chased by Syndicate killers." Chris grinned, eyes flicking between the rear sensor display and the crowded air lanes ahead. Fast ships don't always mean skilled pilots. He abruptly killed the main thrusters, causing the speeder to plummet between 2 skyscrapers. The pursuing vehicles shot past, momentarily losing their target. Sci-Fi gasped as they fell. "Are you insane?" Chris reactivated the engines just before they hit the lower industrial levels, pulling them into a controlled glide through the dense maze of pipes and maintenance tunnels. The Syndicate speeders screeched to a halt above them, momentarily disoriented. He smirked. "Depends on the day." Sci-Fi exhaled sharply. That was terrifying. "You're welcome." Chris banked sharply, slipping into a side corridor barely wide enough for their speeder. "I assume you have a reason for being on tonight's menu?" Sci-Fi's expression darkened. "I was a dancer on Nova Prime. The Syndicate approached me with what sounded like a legitimate entertainment contract." She swallowed hard. "Next thing I knew, I was in chains, being prepped as an exotic delicacy for the highest bidder." Chris clenched his jaw. "Disgusting." "They call it Project Harvest," she continued. "They don't just sell us as food, they experiment on us. I overheard them talking about flavor enhancements and genetic modifications." Chris's fingers tightened around the controls. "They're not just running a black market meat trade. They're using live test subjects." A warning chime echoed through the cockpit. The rear sensor screen flashed, 3 new contacts. The Syndicate had found them again. "They're persistent," Sci-Fi muttered. Let's see if they're smart, Chris said, pulling a small silver sphere from beneath his seat. What is that? A farewell gift from my last contract. He dropped the device behind them. A moment later, a pulse of bright blue energy rippled outward in a perfect sphere. The Syndicate vehicles convulsed mid-air as their systems overloaded. Their engines flickered, and in seconds, the once terrifying speeders spiraled downward, colliding into the lower industrial levels with fiery explosions. Sci-Fi stared. You had an EMP bomb this whole time? Chris winked. I like to be prepared. She let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. You are insane. Chris angled the speeder toward the outskirts of the city. I have a safe house nearby. We can lay low there. Sci-Fi hesitated. And after that? Chris shot her a sideways glance. We figure out how to burn the Syndicate to the ground. The way her expression shifted, from fear to fierce determination, told him she was on board. The safe house and the truth. Chris guided the speeder through the industrial outskirts of New Singapore, avoiding major air lanes where security drones might track their movements. He brought them low over an abandoned sector, a maze of crumbling warehouses and forgotten infrastructure. Sci-Fi fidgeted in her seat, her deep blue eyes scanning the dimly lit landscape. This doesn't look like the kind of place a man like you should call home. Chris smirked. That's the point. It's off the grid. The speeder descended toward what looked like a rusted-out factory. As they approached, a section of the roof retracted, revealing a hidden landing platform. Chris brought the vehicle down smoothly, engaging the security lockdown as the roof sealed behind them. Welcome to my humble hideout, he said, stepping out and offering Sci-Fi a hand. She hesitated before taking it. And here I thought you were just a simple security contractor. Chris led her through a set of reinforced doors into what could only be described as a tactical operations center. Holographic displays flickered with surveillance feeds, encrypted messages scrolled across a separate console, and a weapons rack lined one of the walls. The room was clean, efficient, and built for someone who planned for trouble. Sci-Fi raised an eyebrow. I take it back. You're definitely not a simple contractor. Chris leaned against a desk, crossing his arms. Let's just say my resume is complicated. She turned to face him, her expression guarded but curious. So what's your angle, Chris? Why did you risk your life to get me out of there? Chris met her gaze evenly. Because no one deserves to be treated like property. A flicker of something, trust, passed through her expression. She sat on the edge of his desk, exhaling slowly. They won't stop, you know. The Syndicate. The Stellar Palate was just one of their many front operations. Chris nodded. You mentioned something about Project Harvest. She shuddered. I overheard them talking while I was locked up. They weren't just selling us as food, Chris. They were modifying us. Testing chemicals, altering DNA structures, seeing which traits made us more appealing to certain clients. She hesitated, rubbing her wrists where the shackles had been. I think they injected me with something. Chris pushed off the desk and grabbed a medical scanner from a storage locker. Hold still. Sci-Fi tensed as the device hummed, running a full bioscan. After a few seconds, the screen displayed a series of abnormal readings. Chris frowned. Your DNA markers have been altered. It's subtle, but they did something to you. Sci-Fi's expression darkened. Do you know what? Chris analyzed the readings, his fingers flying across the console. It looks like some kind of forced adaptation process. Enhancing certain biological functions. Strength, endurance, metabolic efficiency. His jaw tightened. They weren't just making you taste better. They were testing human compatibility. Sci-Fi's breath caught. You mean, they weren't just planning to sell me as food? Chris looked at her, his expression grim. They were preparing you for something bigger. A silence fell between them. Sci-Fi ran a hand through her dark hair. I thought being someone's dinner was the worst thing that could happen. Turns out, I was wrong. Chris set the scanner aside. We can figure this out. But we need more information. Sci-Fi looked up at him. You're talking about going back into their system, aren't you? Chris nodded. The Stellar Palate was just one piece of this. If we can get access to their main servers, we can expose everything, who's funding them, where they're operating, and what they're really after. Sci-Fi exhaled sharply, but when she met his gaze, she was resolute. I'm in. Chris grinned. Good. Because I don't plan on doing this alone. But before they could start making plans, an alarm blared through the hideout. Chris whirled toward the security feed, his stomach sinking. Outside, Syndicate vehicles were converging on their location. They found us, Sci-Fi whispered. Chris grabbed a weapon from the rack and tossed another to her. Time to make them regret it. The hunt was far from over. The Syndicate strikes. The first explosion rocked the building, sending dust and debris cascading from the ceiling. Chris barely had time to push Sci-Fi behind cover before a second blast blew apart the reinforced entrance to the safe house. The crimson glow of plasma rifles flared in the dim light as armed Syndicate enforcers poured through the opening, their weapons scanning for targets. Chris didn't hesitate. He grabbed his rifle, ducked behind an overturned workbench, and fired a controlled burst at the first intruder. The Syndicate thug went down with a pained grunt, his weapon clattering to the floor. Sci-Fi, crouched beside him, tightened her grip on the compact energy pistol Chris had tossed her. Are we fighting or running? Chris smirked, sliding a fresh power cell into his rifle. Both. He activated the hideout's emergency defense system. Turret drones hummed to life, popping out from hidden compartments in the ceiling. The Syndicate thugs barely had time to react before the automated guns opened fire, cutting down the frontline attackers. But more were coming. Chris grabbed Sci-Fi's arm and pulled her toward a maintenance shaft in the back of the room. This leads to an underground transit tunnel. We use it to get clear, then circle back. Sci-Fi hesitated only a second before nodding. Together, they ducked into the shaft, the roar of gunfire echoing behind them. The tunnel was narrow and damp, lined with old maintenance wiring and rusted pipes. Chris led the way, his rifle sweeping for threats. Behind them, distant shouts and the clank of boots signaled the Syndicate was in pursuit. Move faster, Chris urged. Sci-Fi didn't argue. Ahead, a faint glow signaled an exit. Chris reached it first, slamming a control panel to unlock the hatch. It groaned open, revealing an abandoned industrial district, perfect for losing their pursuers. They slipped outside, pressing against the shadows. The sound of Syndicate reinforcements filled the air, speeders hovering above, searchlights sweeping the area. Chris's mind raced. We need a ride. Sci-Fi pointed to a nearby docking lot. Several speeder bikes were lined up in an unguarded service area. Chris grinned. I like the way you think. They sprinted toward the bikes, but a sharp voice cut through the night. Stop right there. Chris turned, leveling his rifle. 3 Syndicate enforcers stood between them and the bikes, weapons raised. Sci-Fi muttered, I hate when they do this. Chris sighed. Yeah, me too. Then, without warning, they moved. Chris fired first, dropping one enforcer with a precise headshot. Sci-Fi dove low, rolling across the ground before firing 2 quick shots. The second guard crumpled, his weapon sparking. The last thug hesitated, clearly reconsidering his life choices. Chris raised an eyebrow. Unless you want to be the next meal on the menu, I suggest you walk away. The enforcer dropped his weapon and bolted. Sci-Fi blew out a breath. That went well. Chris smirked. We're not done yet. Get on. They mounted the speeder bikes and gunned the engines. The roar of pursuit vehicles behind them confirmed that the Syndicate wasn't giving up. Chris gritted his teeth. Hold on tight. The chase was far from over. The high-speed escape. Chris twisted the accelerator on the speeder bike, launching it forward at breakneck speed. The wind howled past them as they weaved through the abandoned industrial sector. Sci-Fi clung to his waist, her grip tightening as they narrowly avoided a rusted support beam. Behind them, Syndicate pursuit vehicles roared in hot pursuit. Their sleek black speeders glowed with the telltale red light of plasma cannons, ready to fire. Chris? Sci-Fi's voice carried over the rushing wind. I see them, he called back. A plasma bolt streaked past, scorching the pavement beside them. Chris gritted his teeth and banked hard, sending the speeder into a sharp turn between two crumbling storage units. The narrow space forced the pursuers to adjust, and one Syndicate vehicle clipped the side of a building, spiraling into a fiery explosion. Sci-Fi glanced back. That's one down. Chris smirked. 2 to go. The remaining speeders stayed on them, their pilots more experienced. The industrial district was giving way to a neon-lit marketplace, a bustling underground hub where merchants of questionable legality operated in the shadows of the megacity. Chris had an idea. He yanked the controls to the left, veering straight into the heart of the market. Vendors and shoppers shouted in alarm as the bike shot between stalls, knocking over displays of alien fruit and blinking trinkets. The Syndicate pilots hesitated, unwilling to fire into the crowded area. Sci-Fi caught on immediately. Smart. They can't risk collateral damage. Chris grinned. Exactly. But their luck didn't last long. The Syndicate enforcers, unwilling to let their targets slip away, activated their speeders' gravpulse emitters, sending out shockwaves that flipped over carts and scattered civilians. Chris cursed. Okay, time to rethink. He spotted an old transit tunnel ahead, dark, narrow, and perfect for shaking pursuit. He gunned the engine. Hold on. They shot into the tunnel, the Syndicate vehicles close behind. The walls were tight, leaving almost no room for maneuvering. Sci-Fi's voice was tight with tension. I hope you know what you're doing. Chris's grin never wavered. Just trust me. At the last second, he jerked the controls, sending the bike into a hidden maintenance shaft along the tunnel's side. The Syndicate vehicles, unable to react in time, shot past at full speed. An explosion shook the tunnel as their pursuers crashed headlong into a security barricade. Sci-Fi let out a breath. Remind me never to doubt you again. Chris slowed the bike as they emerged on the other side of the city. The chaos of the chase was behind them. For now, Chris said, checking his navigation. But we're not safe yet. Sci-Fi nodded. Then let's make sure we end this for good. Chris revved the engine. Agreed. The real fight was just beginning. Breaking into the Syndicate's core. Chris and Sci-Fi didn't waste time. They abandoned the speeder bike in a shadowed alley, blending into the lower levels of New Singapore's labyrinthine underworld. Their destination was clear, the Crimson Syndicate's primary data hub. If they wanted to expose Project Harvest and bring down the twisted operation that had nearly turned Sci-Fi into a meal, they needed concrete evidence. Chris led the way, weaving through the crowd of merchants, smugglers, and lowlifes who populated the sector. His security training kept him alert, eyes scanning for potential Syndicate informants. Sci-Fi stayed close. You have a plan, right? Chris smirked. Of course. Does it involve surviving? Chris chuckled. Ideally. They reached an unassuming warehouse near the city's edge. From the outside, it looked abandoned, but Chris knew better. This was where the Syndicate stored their most sensitive data. Sci-Fi narrowed her eyes. Security. Chris tapped into a wrist-mounted device, pulling up a live feed of the area. Automated sentries, motion sensors, and 2 armed guards at the entrance. Sci-Fi glanced at him. Stealth or force? Chris weighed their options. We go quiet until we can't. She smirked. I like the way you think. They moved swiftly. Using the cover of darkness, Chris disabled the exterior cameras with a remote pulse device. The moment the guards turned their backs, he struck, swift, precise. A chokehold silenced the first, and Sci-Fi took down the second with a stun pulse from her pistol. They slipped inside. The interior was a maze of corridors, but Chris had studied the building's layout from stolen blueprints. The server room should be ahead. They crept forward, dodging patrols and slipping past biometric scanners with stolen credentials. Finally, they reached their target. A secured vault-like room containing the Syndicate's core database. Chris hacked into the system, fingers dancing across the console. This is it. Their entire operation, names, locations, even government officials who are funding them. Sci-Fi peered over his shoulder. Can you download it? Chris inserted a data drive. Already on it. A sudden alarm blared. Sci-Fi cursed. They know we're here. Chris yanked the drive free just as the vault doors slammed shut. Red emergency lights bathed the room in an ominous glow. The intercom crackled. Well, a deep, reptilian voice hissed. I was wondering when you'd show up. Chris's jaw clenched. That's Krellick, the Syndicate's regional boss. Sci-Fi's eyes darkened. He's the one who ordered me to be served. The intercom chuckled. I must say, you humans never cease to entertain. Chris ignored the taunt and checked the exits. We need an escape plan. Sci-Fi was already one step ahead. How do you feel about explosives? Chris grinned. Now that's a plan. The Syndicate was closing in. It was time to go loud. The Syndicate's downfall. Chris slammed the data drive into a secure slot on his wrist device, ensuring a backup of their stolen intel. The vault alarms blared, signaling the Syndicate's response team closing in. Sci-Fi crouched near a supply cabinet, pulling out a set of small cylindrical charges. I found these in the storage unit. Chris raised an eyebrow. Explosives? She smirked. Let's call it forced redecoration. Heavy boots pounded against the hallway outside. The Syndicate wasn't wasting time. Chris pulled his rifle from his back. We need to hold them off long enough for the charges to do their job. Sci-Fi quickly set the detonators along the structural supports of the server room. 60 seconds until boom time. The doors burst open, and Syndicate enforcers stormed in. Chris reacted instantly, his rifle barking out controlled bursts. The first two thugs dropped before they could return fire. Sci-Fi, using the chaos, fired precision shots from her pistol, taking down another. The remaining Syndicate forces fanned out, using overturned tables and consoles for cover. You can't win this, one of them barked. Chris grinned. I think we can. Sci-Fi pressed the detonator. The floor trembled. Explosions rocked the structure, sending Syndicate forces scrambling for cover. The server racks crumbled, taking down walls with them. Fire and smoke filled the room. Chris grabbed Sci-Fi's hand. Time to go. They sprinted through the collapsing facility, dodging falling debris in panicked Syndicate operatives. Chris shot a lock off a side exit, kicking the door open. They burst into the night, the cold air hitting them like a wave. Behind them, the entire data hub imploded, taking Project Harvest with it. Sci-Fi turned to Chris, breathing hard. We did it. Chris nodded, watching the flames consume the Syndicate's darkest secrets. Yeah, we did. But their victory wasn't over yet. Chris activated his wrist device, transmitting the stolen files to every major media outlet and law enforcement agency across the sector. And now, the entire galaxy will know. Sci-Fi smiled. The Syndicate is finished. Chris smirked. And New Singapore just became a lot safer. Sci-Fi took his hand. So, what now? Chris glanced at her, feeling something deeper than adrenaline this time. Dinner. A real one. No chains, no syndicates, no running for our lives. Sci-Fi laughed, the tension in her shoulders finally easing. Sounds perfect. As the authorities swarmed in to mop up the remains of the Syndicate, Chris and Sci-Fi walked away, hand in hand, knowing they had not only destroyed a criminal empire but also found something worth fighting for, each other. And for the first time in a long while, Chris was truly hungry, for the right kind of meal.